The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
Over the past 10 years, the Great Lakes have experienced both historic high lake levels and historic lows. These extreme fluctuations cause flooding, erosion, and property damage, often putting people living in communities at risk. What's interesting is that when we think about the use of nature-based features to increase coastal resilience, the current focus is mostly on coasts along the ocean. But what about the Great Lakes? Well, here are some interesting facts. The combined U.S. and Canadian coast of the Great Lakes is a whopping 10,900 miles long. The U.S. portion alone is 4,530 miles long, which is nearly equal to the Gulf, Atlantic, and Pacific U.S. shorelines combined. And approximately 34 million people in the United States and Canada live in the Great Lakes Basin. So many people's lives and the economies of 8 states and 2 provinces are directly affected. Today, we're talking about the Great Lakes and what's being done to make them more resilient to the effects of climate change. Welcome to Season 8, Episode 4. I am here with my frequent co-host, Burton Suedel, who's a research biologist in the Environmental Lab at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Engineer Research Development Center. Welcome back, Burton.
Thanks, Sarah. Very pleased to be back with you today to talk about the important work that we're doing in the Great Lakes region. Very much looking forward to our conversation today.
We are too. And I'm really happy to introduce our guest today, David Bucaro. David is Chief of the Planning Branch at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Chicago District. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm always happy to talk about what we're doing on the Great Lakes.
Excellent. Burton, you've been working with David on a number of initiatives over the years. So tell us a bit about David.
Hey, Sarah, I'd be glad to. It's been a pleasure for me to work with David for the past several years on various projects in the Great Lakes region. You know, David's an engineer and since January of 2023, a planner within the Army Corps of Engineers and has served as the chief of the planning branch of the Chicago District. So, David, we'd love to hear about your journey today.
Sure. I always find it interesting to look back and how I got to where I am today with 25 years of federal service doing large-scale water resource planning. I've had a pretty linear journey, which is something folks always seem to be surprised to hear when I tell them. I guess first off, the concept of service was instilled in me through a young age through scouting. I distinctly remember the first 3 merit badges that I earned were citizenship in the community, nation, and world. I guess I was destined for public service. And as a child, I enjoyed tinkering with a lot of things and to see how they worked, you name it, from small engines, tractors, cars, trucks. It always helped that I grew up in a rural area with space available to house my various hobbies and a father who encouraged those curiosities. Since I excelled in both math and science while in high school, when it came time to select a major in college, I remembered how my dad would say how infrastructure in the U.S. was aging, and there'd always be a need for engineers to rebuild the nation. Now, bear in mind, my family trips growing up weren't complete without a stop to a lock and dam, a navigation channel, or a huge bridge. So I pursued a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the Indiana Institute of Technology in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and it was an application-based engineering program. And I was fortunate enough in the summers to find a number of internships in engineering, first with a chemical manufacturing company, then a large paving contractor, and finally a small civil sanitary consulting firm.
So, David, I understand you went to graduate school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign And that's what ultimately led you to the Corps.
My first semester of my graduate program, my advisor there made me aware of an opportunity to work for the Corps of Engineers at the Construction Engineering Research Lab, also known as CERL. And so I worked there throughout my graduate degree doing research on erosion control methods on training lands. And I was excited to visit Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is home of the 82nd Airborne, to see how different innovative erosion control designs were performed on various drop zones for parachute drop zones and tank trails. It wasn't long that I was hooked not only on water resources, but the Corps of Engineers.
Well, I can certainly see why.
I had a thirst for working for a district office on large infrastructure projects where pretty much the rubber meets the road, harkening back to those vacations with my dad, where we toured those locks, dams, and harbors and things like that. So in 2000, when I graduated with a master's degree, I joined the Chicago district. And the district has a rotational intern program, which afforded me the opportunity to really work across all the various disciplines within the district, from engineering, operations, project management, and planning. I've spent the first few years of my career as a hydraulic and hydrologic engineer developing H&H models for a variety of flood risk management and aquatic ecosystem restoration projects. And over time, I was able to work with several experienced engineers and planners, and in turn grew an appreciation for the planning process.
Well, tell us about that, David. How did you become a planner?
There was a big turning point in my career in 2005 where I was given an opportunity to move to the planning branch. So I did. I took that opportunity, and over the next 12 years, first as a lead planner, and then as the chief of plan formulation and economics for nearly a decade, I developed a real passion for planning. My team of planners, engineers, economists got to lead many large and complex feasibility studies, including the Upper Des Plaines River, the Great Lakes and Mississippi River Basin Interbasin Study, Bubbly Creek, which is an urban restoration study, a dredge material management plan at Calumet Harbor, and so on and so forth.
So over the next 10 years, you took a lot of planning courses, and in 2017, you became a certified water resources planner.
I also became a project management chief, and then the first Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study project manager. Then in late 22, as Burton mentioned, I had the opportunity to return to the planning branch to be its chief. And I always had a dream to hold that position. And I'll tell you, the past 2 years as the chief of planning for the Chicago district has been quite rewarding and quite busy.
Well, I'll tell you what, that makes David a natural fit to take on the responsibility for coordinating the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study.
I would say, and we want to talk about that, and we want to talk about your current role as chief of the planning branch in some detail, David. But we're curious about what drives you. We love learning about what our guests are really passionate about. So tell us about your passion.
I really love to solve problems. It really comes down to that. And about 15 years ago, former Chief of Engineers, Lieutenant General Robert Van Antwerp, told a story at a planning conference I was at on how Walt Disney coined the term Imagineering for what his team of designers did. And General Van Antwerp said at the time that USACE should coin the term solutioneering, because that's what we do, collaborating to find creative and innovative solutions to the nation's toughest engineering challenges. I guess that sort of stuck with me because as a core planner, that's exactly what I'm passionate about. In addition, I like wonking out on legislation and policy. I actually find it fascinating, especially how it's evolved over time. I'm kind of a history buff, so researching legislation as it pertains to various core project authorizations scratches that itch for me. I'm also passionate about shaping the Corps' future civil works program to address the water resource challenges of the future, and finding those opportunities to push the envelope and innovate solutions on a watershed scale. And a great example of that is why we're here today, to talk about incorporating the principles of engineering with nature at a watershed scale within the Great Lakes.
It certainly sounds like an outstanding opportunity, as David says, particularly at the watershed scale, and lines very, very well with David's interests and his experience and his passion. And I think these are the leadership qualities we need as we collaborate with our many partners, stakeholders, and tribal nations, who the Corps is working very closely with on the future of the Great Lakes.
Absolutely. I think this is a great place to pick up and talk about the impact of climate change on the Great Lakes and why the need to focus on making the Great Lakes more resilient. So, David, talk about some of the impacts that we're already seeing.
Sure. It's important to understand the full context of the impact of climate change. And as you mentioned at the top of the episode, over 34 million people live within the Great Lakes Basin, and over 4 million live within 2 miles of the coast, and many more work and recreate along the coast. And the Great Lakes is huge. They comprise 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water and 95% of the U.S. supply. There are 60 commercial harbors moving over 125 million tons of commodities each year, including feeding the nation's cold-rolled steel production critical for the automobile and other sectors. The Great Lakes maritime economy is valued at over $17 billion annually and drives over 290,000 jobs.
That really is amazing. And then there are the many social and economic benefits to consider.
A third of the nation's registered recreational boats are from the Great Lakes states, and the Great Lakes has some of the world's most significant freshwater coastal habitats, wetlands, bluffs, dunes, beaches, and a rich biodiversity, also comprised of several threatened and endangered species. In short, there's immense economic, environmental, social, and cultural value to the Great Lakes that can be impacted through climate change.
Well, David, okay, you've convinced us that the Great Lakes is critical and plays a significant role in the heart of North America. Tell us how it's being affected by climate change.
Sure, we're already experiencing the effects of climate change on the Great Lakes, from more rapidly changing water levels to less ice conditions. And the 5th National Climate Assessment, that's the latest assessment that was released last November, identified increases in precipitation and air temperature will result in increased variability in the Great Lakes. We're already seeing that. There's a complex interaction between lakes, land, and atmosphere that make the system difficult to model, and the long-term projections of lake levels will have high uncertainty. This uncertainty creates a challenge for making informed, resilient, and adaptable decisions to long-term investments. But to help better prepare for these future conditions, we're working collaboratively with other federal agencies, state and academic partners as we work to identify the full range of Great Lakes water levels, wave heights, and ice conditions under a range of plausible climate change scenarios.
So all of that uncertainty about climate change and the impact on the Great Lakes is really driving the need for your Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study, or GLCRS, as you call it. And I understand this is a 6-year effort. It's being led by the Army Corps of Engineers. And in fact, David, you're the lead. So this is a huge, huge undertaking. Tell us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. It's a massive $14.4 million study, and several members of my planning team are leading the study. The Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study, it's a regional partnership of the Corps and all 8 Great Lakes states working together in collaboration with expertise from federal agencies, tribal nations, state and local governments to create a strategy that identifies vulnerable coastal areas and offers an array of potential actions that can be taken to bolster the built and natural coastal environments. What we're trying to do is develop a plan so that these coastal areas can improve the ability to withstand, recover, and adapt given the uncertainty of climate change impacts.
Talk a little bit about your relationship with the Canadian side of the Great Lakes.
Sure. While the study is focused on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes, we have engagement and alignment with several Canadian partners and stakeholders. We've been collaborating at the embassy level, folks with Environment and Climate Change Canada, the International Joint Commission, and most of it has been informal to date. We've worked with the Great Lakes Adaptive Management group within IJC, and we actually have 2 technical experts from Canada on our as reviewers on our climate change modeling effort.
Let's talk about the work that's underway now on the Great Lakes Coastal Resilience Study. I understand that the first big step was defining a shared vision, and that was quite a bit of work. Tell us how the vision was developed, David.
We employed a rigorous outreach process for developing the shared vision that included 12 total virtual workshops that included, the Corps, all 8 Great Lakes states, the tribal nations, federal, state, and local agencies, and the general public, people who live, work, and recreate on the Great Lakes. We really had good participation at each of those meetings, and we received individual input from hundreds of folks.
David, you heard from multiple stakeholders, all different points of view. One of the things we'd be really interested in hearing about were the priorities that you heard from the tribal nations that participated.
Yeah, we've received a lot of input from the tribal nations, and one comment in particular was really interesting. The tribal nations asked us to reframe the statement to avoid perpetuating Western-centric and extractive narratives, really in urging us to be more inclusive portrayal of tribal perspectives. And the comment highlighted that many tribal communities view coastal resources differently, in that it's a human-centric perspective, that what we had provided initially was a human-centric perspective, insinuating that we are protecting resources in order to keep exploiting them. And it was really interesting to take that perspective and then modify the shared vision to not use a human-centric perspective.
I love that. So tell us, what was the vision that resulted from this process?
Our vision for the Great Lakes coast is thriving and adaptable communities, ecosystems, economies, cultural heritage and recreational opportunities, and equitable access for present and future generations in perpetuity.
That sounds like a very ambitious project and a whole lot to accomplish in about 6 years, with many moving parts. Can you tell us a little bit about what's been accomplished so far?
We've made actually a lot of progress to date. We started with an execution of a cost-sharing agreement with the 8 states in September of 22. And bear in mind, it took us 6 years in the making to get federal funding and the advocacy needed to secure that federal funding, and then the negotiation process to execute a 9-party agreement. But once we executed that agreement, then we took 8 months to do detailed scoping, including the sign-off and approval by all 8 states and the Corps of Engineers. Then we initiated the study activities in July of 23. So we're about, a little over a year into it. And there's 3 primary steps to the study. The first step is developing the shared vision milestone and shared vision statement, which we talked about. Concurrently with that, we're developing a basin-wide assessment of vulnerabilities to assess existing conditions, existing resources, and assessing the vulnerability of those to a range of future conditions. So that's really a mapping exercise to look at existing populations, infrastructure, habitat, land use, socially vulnerable populations, things like that, across all of the Great Lakes coast, and conduct an exposure assessment based on existing coastal resources and the range of those future high and low water conditions and varying ice conditions due to climate change.
Oh, David, that sounds good. Sounds like you made a lot of really good progress so far. Now, can you tell us a little bit about how you are specifically using scenarios to assess the expected future water levels, wave heights, and ice conditions that you had mentioned?
Sure. That's actually what we call the GLRI framework for short. And it's funded by US EPA's Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And it's conducted through a collaborative team that I mentioned before, consisting of federal, state, and academia. This is a $4.6 million research effort that will help communities better understand the frequency and impacts of various climate scenarios based on plausible changes in temperature and precipitation according to the best scientific information available. Among its products will be a public website that will allow users to explore static water levels under a range of possible climate scenarios. The study will also provide more detailed information for planners and engineers calculating total water levels that account for ice, waves, and surge for 5 of the most representative climate scenarios. And all of this data builds upon the Coastal Hazard System, which is a tool developed by the Corps of Engineers Research and Development Center to quantify storm hazards along the U.S. coastlines. We're looking to roll out the static water level information in 2025.
I think that's so interesting that you're looking at a whole range of conditions. Certainly where I live on the Great Lakes near Lake Ontario, we've seen so many changing conditions over just the past few years. We've seen everything from deep freeze and ice to, certainly in the last couple of years, very mild winters and no ice. So it's great that you're focusing not just on water levels, but on the whole watershed and really the big picture. Can you talk a little bit about why taking a holistic perspective on this is so important, David?
Assessing the whole watershed or the entire coast of the Great Lakes is extremely important in taking a holistic perspective. We need to understand the exposure of people, communities, infrastructure, environmental, and historic resources to these future climate scenarios. If the way that these coasts work is that they're very dynamic, and what happens in one area can affect other areas. And so taking a more holistic approach is extremely important.
Tell us a little bit about the second step, determining actions to make the Great Lakes more resilient. Tell us what that entails.
So after we identify the basin-wide analysis and we have a better sense on where kind of those hotspot areas are that are more vulnerable to future conditions, and we're going to take a more focused evaluation to identify specific actions for those hotspot areas, which would include a combination of monitoring and further study for action. And we're scheduled to host 14 in-person 2-day workshop meetings, which will involve the owners and operators of different coastal resources selected for further study. Each of those workshops will focus on about 10 specific resources. The 8 Great Lakes states are going to select the locations for those focused area evaluations. And during those workshops, we'll conduct a more detailed evaluation of vulnerability and potential consequences associated with each selected resource. That's where the role of natural and nature-based features comes in.
We found out there's already some great examples, the implementation of nature-based solutions around the Great Lakes. And some of those we've actually been able to publish in Volume 3 of the Engineer with Nature Atlas. For example, the Fort Sheridan project that I had an opportunity to visit in person just last year comes immediately to mind, but there certainly are others. And so these can all be good inputs in the development of the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Plan.
I agree. Developing the Coastal Resiliency Plan will include strategic recommendations and prioritized actions for the Corps, other federal agencies, states, locals, and other non-federal interests. We recognize we're not going to be able to answer every question throughout this study or analyze every potential vulnerability as part of this. But we hope that what we do provides the Great Lakes community with information on how water levels might change and coastal resources that may be impacted under a variety of future climate scenarios. This work is expected to lay the foundation for future studies that would then make more specific recommendations.
David, that's a great overview of the study. Thank you so much. This is a good place to stop and share a brief word from our sponsor, the Engineering with Nature program. The Engineering with Nature approach is all about practical solutions that don't just fix problems temporarily, but work with natural processes for lasting impact. And if you're in the Great Lakes region, you're seeing this action right now. Picture Illinois Beach State Park. Lake Michigan's waves used to hammer the shore, eroding habitat and damaging the landscape. But instead of building walls, underground rubble ridges were put in to slow down the waves and create fish habitats. That's right, protecting the coast and making room for wildlife. Or take Interstate Island, where the high water levels almost erase the habitat of the endangered common tern. The solution? Sediment dredged from the Duluth Superior Harbor was used to turn that disappearing island into a resilient nesting ground. And what's really neat is that the sediment would have been dumped in a confined disposal facility. So this island habitat enhancement was accomplished at no additional cost. Now that's engineering with nature in action. These are just two of the 60 plus projects you'll find in the Engineering with Nature Atlas, Volume 3. It's a beautifully illustrated book that's all about nature-based solutions. You can go to engineeringwithnature.org or follow the link in our show notes to download your copy and see how nature-based solutions are making a difference in the Great Lakes and beyond. Burton, I understand that the work that you're doing on the Great Lakes Engineering with Nature Playbook study will actually contribute to the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study. And in fact, you're the PI for this playbook. So tell us a little bit about the Engineering with Nature Playbook and how it fits into the picture here.
The Engineering with Nature Playbook is designed to be quite complementary with the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study. You know, the overall purpose of the playbook is to develop new conceptual nature-based designs specific to the Great Lakes that will achieve greater resiliency and adaptability to climate change than conventional designs. The conceptual nature-based designs that we will be developing are intended to be used not only by the planners and nature-based solutions practitioners within the Army Corps of Engineers, but also those nature-based solutions practitioners outside of the Corps, not only to support the planning level cost-benefit analyses, but under a range of conditions and future climate change scenarios that David had just spoken about a minute ago. We believe this information will help nature-based solutions practitioners have a better understanding of the adaptive capacity and the failure tipping points on our infrastructure projects and the communities that rely on them.
And I understand participation of stakeholders will be a big part of your work.
Of course, our stakeholders and tribal nations and the way in which we engage them and coordinate with them through the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study will be very, very important to ensure that the results will not only be relevant, but also accepted in the Great Lakes region. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask David to talk about how the Great Lakes Engineer with Nature Playbook will be used in the Army Corps of Engineers planning process going forward.
We envision utilizing the playbook to inform a broader set of solutions across the Great Lakes that can be utilized in the coastal resiliency study. Our current, as you mentioned, our current understanding of natural nature-based features and multiple lines of defense, which is really the combination of nature-based solutions and more gray technologies working in harmony, is pretty much limited to the ocean coast. And so there's a lack of confidence in utilizing these innovative technologies within the Great Lakes region. Having the playbook is going to give us that confidence to be able to make recommendations for certain areas. We have several good examples of nature-based solution applications that have been implemented in the past few years, and we want to build upon that and bring that basin-wide.
David, adaptive capacity is so critical to the changing conditions that the Great Lakes will experience. Really interested in hearing your perspective on the role of nature-based solutions and why nature-based solutions are going to be such a critical part of the coastal resiliency plan.
Sure. From my perspective, we can't simply just do the same old thing of hardening our shorelines. We need to consider more holistic nature-based solutions that work in harmony with the changing environment so that those solutions are better able to adapt to greater variabilities caused by climate change.
Right, you're absolutely right, David. The importance of adaptive capacity cannot be understated. And this is in clear alignment with Army Corps of Engineers Engineer with Nature program. As an R&D program, Engineer with Nature continues to contribute to support this effort to help, reduce coastal storm risk, improve resilience, and improve adaptive capacity of our infrastructure and communities that rely on them.
David, this work is so important, and you're going to come up with a bunch of innovative solutions. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Plan benefiting other regions and helping other planners?
Absolutely. So the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study isn't the first resiliency study that has been completed across the coast. And frankly, we were inspired by the North Atlantic Coastal Comprehensive Study, which was the post-Sandy study that the Northeast completed. And after that, the South Atlantic Coastal Study, which was recently completed. So we are taking lessons learned from both of those studies, and we hope that the process and outcomes from the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Study could be a benefit to other areas of the country and other planners, including those across the Corps of Engineers. It's really we're building upon what others have done before us, and then we're providing this information as a legacy for others within the Corps and other regions to utilize as well.
And David, you bring up a really, really good point because the overall framework is expected to be widely applicable, not only within the Great Lakes region, but also well beyond from coast to coast within the U.S.
Really is going to advance the practice. And I mean, that's so much key to engineering with nature, continuous learning and advancing the practice and the application of nature-based solutions. So it's just really exciting work. I know there's a lot of work ahead for both of you and for your many, many collaborators. David, tell us a little bit about what you're going to be focused on over the next several months.
Sure, Sarah. We have several focuses on the future climate change scenarios and the GLRI framework. We're working on that to complete the static water levels and release of that next year. We're in the near final stages of addressing technical comments and getting that out. That work will become the basis for the basin-wide analysis. And so we're working right now on the basin-wide analysis, which will also be rolled out in 2025. And in addition to that, we're gearing up for the focused area evaluation. So there's just a lot going on right now amongst my team and the other two districts of Detroit and Buffalo and our collaborators. And then Burton is working with his team on the playbook, and our goal is to have all of these things kind of come together into the Coastal Resiliency Plan later on in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely, David. From my perspective, I'm very much looking forward to beginning work on the playbook here in November of 2024. And we're about ready to get started on that here in the very, very near future. And very much looking forward to coordinating with you and the rest of the GLCRS team going forward, not only on the playbook, but coordinating with Coastal Resiliency Study team as well.
David, we often wrap up our show by asking our guests if they have a call to action for our listeners. So Burton and I would like to ask you, what's your call to action?
Thanks, Sarah. I guess a call to action for those living on the Great Lakes Basin would be to please get involved. We want to hear from you. We have multiple public meetings. We have another public meeting coming up on the 2nd of December. And we have updates that you can sign up for and share your feedback. We're interested in learning what you have experience living on and near the Great Lakes coast and where the vulnerabilities are from your perspective. We want to make sure that we capture those. I'd like to ask all of our listeners to subscribe to our email newsletter and study updates on our website.
Great. We'll make sure that we put those links in our show notes.
And to build on that, David, too, we are really looking for new innovative solutions to help make the Great Lakes Basin more resilient to effects of climate change, interacting already with our stakeholders, partners, and tribal nations. We've identified a lot of really innovative solutions that are being implemented already. And as you mentioned, David, the conventional way of infrastructure armoring is not the solution. The business as usual solution is not going to be the way forward in terms of addressing meaningfully with a changing climate, because there are better ways of doing things, particularly incorporating and finding ways to incorporate natural infrastructure and natural features into our infrastructure project. And to be fully successful, I think everyone's input is not only helpful, but it's going to be needed to be fully successful going forward.
Burton and David, this is just a perfect way to wrap up this episode. The Great Lakes Basin is, as David said, is such an important part of North America. David, with your leadership, we know you can bring the experience, expertise, and the best thinking of the many partners, stakeholders, and collaborators together to develop the Great Lakes Coastal Resiliency Plan over the next 6 years. We know you've got a really big job ahead, and we certainly appreciate you taking the time to join Burton and I on the Engineering with Nature podcast.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Burton, for this opportunity to talk about the work we're doing in the Great Lakes. We recognize that Congress and the 8 Great Lakes states have given the Corps a great opportunity to lead the development of a comprehensive plan for protecting one of the nation's most precious resources, the coasts of the Great Lakes. We don't take this lightly, but to do this right, to make a generational impact, we need to not only think innovatively, but we need stakeholder input.
Hey, David, thanks so much for joining the podcast today. And I really look forward to continue to working with you together on these projects. And I think they're going to be important contributions to the Great Lakes going forward. So very much looking forward to continue our close collaboration.
And Burton, it's always a pleasure to have you as a co-host, and we certainly look forward to hearing how the Great Lakes Engineering with Nature playbook is progressing.
Oh, Sarah, thank you very much for that. And I'm been very much looking forward to getting started on the Great Lakes playbook. And I certainly promise to keep you in the loop as we progress going forward on this 3-year playbook project.
Awesome. And to all of you, thank you so much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and we hope you'll join us again as we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN podcast is produced by iContact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.